Hi, welcome to the latest installment of the Pain Institute podcast. I'm joined with Dr. Jennifer Miskimins, who is a professor at the Colorado School of Mines. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Miskimins.
My pleasure, Jordy.
There's a lot of conversation about oil and gas these days, and I was wondering if you had seen some of the headlines, death of U.S. oil. Do you think it's as bad as everyone is saying?
I don't personally think it's as bad as everyone is saying. I think it's definitely uncharted territories for a lot of reasons. Our industry is used to a lot of ups and downs. We're used to cyclic behavior. But this definitely is an unusual situation for the COVID-19 issues. And then when you're combining that with the economies of the world slowing down, we're used to cyclic behavior, but this one's been, this downward cycle's probably been one of the sharpest and fastest, I think, that the industry has ever seen. Death of the entire industry, I think, is definitely a little overkill and stretching it. When the economy does start to recover, and it will, it has to. We as a human race are going to have to see things restart a little bit. When the economy restarts, we're going to see the need for energy, and we've not discovered any new undiscovered energy resources that weren't available 6 months ago that are going to be available between now and as that recovery starts. So we're going to need the energy that the oil and gas, natural gas, can supply, and it's not just energy. Also, it's manufacturing and feedstocks for manufacturing. So when you look at how the economy has slowed down with people staying at home and not driving as much, and obviously with airlines shut down quite a bit, those are big areas that as the economy starts to pick back up and those things start up again, the need for energy is going to be there. It's going to take a while, but it's going to come back. It has to come back to support that economy recovery.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you that we kind of go through these cyclical stages, and that's something important to remember when we're in these economic downturns, especially for oil. So the U.S. has over 9,000 independent oil and gas operators, and everyone likes to talk about U.S. shale as kind of this big indicator of how the market is moving. Did something have to give way, or is the U.S. just especially susceptible? Do you feel like the U.S. has responded to this oil and gas crisis a little differently, or they've been affected by it differently than other nations?
I think they have been affected by it differently. In the U.S., and you mentioned it, we're pretty focused on shale reservoirs right now. And one thing that people need to understand about oil and gas reservoirs worldwide is that the rocks and the reservoirs that we pull these hydrocarbons from are not all created equal by any means. And because they're not created equal, the cost of actually lifting those hydrocarbons to the surface of the earth is quite variable. Some wells, when we drill them, are currently flowing, and so it doesn't cost a lot of money once the well is drilled and completed and started to produce. It doesn't cost a lot of money to continue that production. Whereas other types of reservoirs, you have to run pumps and physically use those pumps to actually lift fluids to the surface. They're called operating expenses, the costs that go into this. And operating expenses can vary greatly from just a 50 cents a barrel or $1 a barrel of oil all the way up to something around the order of $30 per barrel of oil. And then you throw in the cost of actually drilling and completing those wells. Some wells are cheaper to drill and complete than others. And so bottom line, what that means is the cost to actually provide a barrel of oil can vary significantly, both from the capital startup and then the operating expenses that go along with it. In the U.S., we are producing from reservoirs that tend to be a little more expensive to produce from. And that's something that operators are always looking at. They're always looking at how can they reduce those costs and still from a technical standpoint, do what they need to do. But bottom line, we're producing from reservoirs that have in the United States that are lower quality than some reservoirs in other parts of the world, which does handicap us a little bit. We can, when oil prices are high and you're past that price point, it's obviously profitable for companies to produce those reservoirs. But as the price of oil goes down, that price point becomes much more of a pinch point. And in the US, we have a much higher pinch point than other countries do. So what that probably means when you got 9,000 oil and gas operators in the US, if they were financially in trouble to start with before this crisis that's happened this year, they're probably really susceptible to failure. And those that weren't maybe quite as susceptible prior to this or weren't as over leveraged are coming closer to that break-even point. And so it just makes them more susceptible to potential failure. So we're going to see companies that go out of business. There's no doubt about it. We're going to see other companies that are perfectly fine. When I say that they're perfectly fine, they're more diversified. And by being more diversified, they might not be quite as susceptible to certain cost points.
Great, thank you. I like your points about cost being a big factor in this, and we're starting to see renewable technologies become cost competitive. But like you were saying, there's no energy technology right now that hasn't been around, and all energy forecasts that I've seen have shown that cumulative oil and gas demand is only going to increase. And you mentioned a little bit that might see these companies going under. In very general terms, from an oil and gas perspective, can you talk a little bit about what the future of energy holds in the industry?
Yeah, so I'll try and get my crystal ball out a little bit. It's tough. Energy transition has been something that's been talked about for a long time, and I think a lot of people visualize it as being this sharp corner that one day we're in this type of energy form, and the next day all of a sudden we're in another type. And I think when you think about energy transition, it's not a day-to-day thing. It's not a month-to-month thing. It's probably a decade-to-decade thing. And again, kind of coming back to the fact that hydrocarbons are very much part of our energy mix, but they're also part of our manufacturing mix. So as energy sources are replaced or become cost competitive, it doesn't preclude the fact that the industry is needed for other areas. Also, as we're starting to go into these energy transitions, I think a lot of oil and gas companies are also very focused on how can they help become part of that transition. And what I mean by that is things like when you were looking at CO2 sequestration, which can actually not only benefit the environment, but it can also have benefits on producing from reservoirs and actually increasing recovery from some of our oil and gas reservoirs. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a win-win. So I think we're going to see transition, but I don't think the industry is going to go away overnight by any means. I think companies are going to evolve as those opportunities become apparent to them. And the industry is going to be around for several decades as that transition starts to occur. So I think, there's no one source out there right now that's just, red flags like we've been talking that says this is going to replace everything. If it was, it would already have done that. So I think we're going to see, into the future, I think we're going to see the need for petroleum engineers by far. I think we're going to need to see petroleum engineers, though, that think maybe a little bit differently than those that graduated 20 years ago or 30 years ago, because I think the opportunities and the ways they're going to have to approach development of fields is going to be a little different. Energy demand is, like you mentioned, energy demand is continued to project to go up. I mean, we're obviously in a bump right now where we're seeing it down because of economic issues, but it's not just the recovery of those economies. We're also looking at places where energy brings improved level of living to people. Energy brings that ability for people to have their standard of living increase. And so I think as we go into the future, that demand of the world's population to want to have their standard of living increase, if they don't have that standard at this point in time, that's not going to go away. And as the population increases, the need for the energy is going to increase also.
So you mentioned a couple of things I'd like to talk on or touch on. So you mentioned that oil companies are kind of looking to be part of this transition. I remember I was at a talk that Shell gave at School of Mines, and they said they don't want to be the next oil and gas company. They want to be the world's energy company. And we see that with their investment, like you said, in various technologies like carbon capture and wind turbines. Natural gas is also a big subject that people talk about with the energy future in the oil and gas industry. Can you explain kind of some of the basics of how that might shift the oil and gas industry, or is there anything that you think that people should know about natural gas? Fracking was kind of like the last major shift in the oil and gas industry, and I think people are still mischaracterizing it to this day. Is there anything you want to talk or mention about natural gas you think is relevant to its future in the evolving energy landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess from a technical standpoint, maybe just to start off, people think about the oil industry and they think of oil, they think of liquid flowing, black oil, the Beverly Hillbillies kind of thing. Oil and gas reservoirs, and I use that word gas, we're not talking like the gas that you put in your cars. We're talking natural gas, so an actual gas. And when people talk about the oil industry, really what it is it's the hydrocarbon industry. And so we are producing fluids that come from a reservoir that some of them are liquids, like the black oil, although it can be also green and red and white and clear actually. But there's also quite a bit of natural gas that's present in those reservoirs, and that's physically gas. So we're looking at anywhere, methane. A lot of people might be more familiar with propane because of the propane tanks that they hook up to their barbecues. That's also the type of fluids that are coming out of these reservoirs. And natural gas has a lot of benefits to it. First of all, it's extremely clean burning when it's actually burned. It's a really good replacement for electrical plants. And so you've seen over time a lot of electrical plants that were burning coal have now switched to natural gas. And natural gas it can also be a feedstock in certain manufacturing processes also. So natural gas has always kind of been the sidekick to oil. Oil has, from a economic standpoint, maybe always been a little, at least generally speaking, there's always crossovers, but generally speaking, oil has been the liquid portion has been what most companies have gone for because the economic benefits they see from it are greater. What we're seeing now with what's happening in the markets and talking to a lot of companies, natural gas prices are actually starting to become very cost competitive to oil, I guess you would say. And we're seeing a little bit of a focus on companies saying, well, we might not be using our capital budget in 2021 for drilling oil wells, but we actually might start now to look at drilling something that's more of a natural gas majority-based type of production. And so natural gas is, there's a lot of benefits to it just from an environmental standpoint. But interestingly enough, we're starting to see the economic benefits kind of pop up a little bit more. The thing about it, and kind of getting back to your point about, hydraulic fracturing is, hydraulic fracturing is also something that is needed for a lot of natural gas production. And so it's the technique of hydraulically fracturing and stimulating a well like that is necessary both for oil production, but also for natural gas production. And kind of a side note there, I'd agree with you. I think the process is still a little a lot misunderstood. We are a soundbite society, and that 30 seconds that sometimes we see on the news is not necessarily the most technically competent or most technically sound description of hydraulic fracturing. A lot of times I tell people, if they ask me about it, I said, I won't talk to you about it for 30 seconds. You have to give me 30 minutes because I want to be able to actually explain the technology to you and explain the process to people so that they understand that there is a lot of technology behind it, and it is actually a very safe process.
Yeah, and that's a big problem that we see. I especially was very grateful for my petroleum engineering degree that you helped get me. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much misinformation out there. You know, people still think that oil and gas is made from dinosaurs and things like that. You mentioned the future might have a different type of petroleum engineer than the past 20 years ago. So do you see any educational changes happening to reflect the evolving oil and gas landscape as a professor at School of Mines?
Yes, I do find that there are going to be a lot of educational changes. And I think educational changes not just for petroleum engineering education, but in general. If nothing else, this COVID-19 issue that we're dealing with has caused a lot of people to reevaluate things like online learning and distance learning and how that can be done at a much improved level. From the oil and gas standpoint, for petroleum engineering in general, we were already seeing changes before this recent downturn, and some of those changes include expansion of new topics of petroleum engineers. So a petroleum engineer might, used to get classes in drilling, and they used to get classes in production, and they used to get classes in things like, hydraulic fracturing and management of reservoirs. What we're seeing an expansion to is we're seeing an expansion first in the area of what's known as data analytics. We take a lot of digital data in the oil and gas industry, a tremendous. In fact, I saw at one point in time, I think the number was close to any given well in the first year of that well's life has something like 1 billion data points associated with it between all the data that we're taking while we're drilling it versus all the data that we're taking while we're producing it. And so data analytics, or taking a look at how we can statistically analyze that data. And what we're looking at there is we're starting to look at things, artificial intelligence, as far as a petroleum engineer, I can sit there and I can't process that many data points in my mind. So from a computer program standpoint, is there artificial intelligence help me actually pick out something that I would not been able to see as a human. And so we're seeing a really big push in our industry for that. Colorado School of Mines, we're starting to offer classes in it. We have been teaching some classes for several years in it, actually, but we're getting ready to offer a graduate certificate in this particular area just to meet the demand that the industry is looking for. The other big one is a big area that we've kind of already talked a little bit about is expansion of petroleum engineers to understand the concept even more than they have in the past. And they always have had to have a little bit of this, but things like sustainability and corporate social responsibility, license to operate. It's not just because you've leased the land anymore that you get to, go drill a well. It's working with communities and working with community leaders and populations to make them, or to help them understand how oil and gas development occurs, how it can be done more safely. We're seeing a fairly big push that ties to things like what it's known as midstream, which is taking the petroleum engineering used to just get to the fluids to the surface and then let somebody else take over. And now petroleum engineers are becoming more and more involved in pipelines, flow lines, processing of those hydrocarbons before they get to a refinery to maximize the value. So we're seeing a pretty broad expansion of what was traditionally petroleum engineering. And a lot of that is starting to go toward that energy transition that we've talked about. And We're even seeing increases in petroleum engineers working in areas like geothermal, because it's a very, very similar process to petroleum engineering, just a different fluid type that we're looking at in the rock. So, yeah, the petroleum engineering has currently one of the highest credit counts at Colorado School of Mines, and we're trying to figure out that credit count, but also make sure that engineers are exposed to all these different areas. So there's a lot of different directions people can go.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's especially relevant, like you were saying, data analytics. We're seeing that kind of creep into a lot of different fields, and it just offers so many advantages. And corporate social responsibility as well. We're seeing all these companies really becoming aware of how much of an issue that is in operating, and like you were saying, the social license to operate. Well, thank you for all that, and thank you for your time. I appreciate you being a guest. Do you have any final thoughts, or do you have any? I remember you had some great stories too about how one time we hydraulically fractured with a nuclear bomb, and I love telling everyone that story. If you have anything else like that, or you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, you should point people to the fact that was in the 1960s, and we don't do that anymore. But I think in general, probably the one thing, and I'm telling a lot of students this right now too, is the oil and gas industry is not going to go away. We're not seeing petroleum engineering is not going to go away. It's still going to be a very beneficial career in the future. But what's happening now with the economy and everything, I think we're in for a really, really bumpy ride the next year and a half, maybe even up to 2 or 3 years as all of this gets sorted out. But, I think I have faith that it will get sorted out. I have faith that we're going to see some improvements come out of it also. I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? And anytime that we've seen hiccups in the past, or huge swings in the past of oil and gas prices like this, we've actually seen technology improve on the, coming out the far side. So I think that's something to kind of hang on to is it's going to be a bumpy ride, but we're going to come out the other side better when we do get to that point. So hopefully that's a little encouraging to people.
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you. And thank you for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure, Jordy. Always good to talk to you.